Welcome to day 18 of Western Civilization. Today we'll look at the 30 Years' War. Notable dates to keep in mind are 1648, which is the Peace of Westphalia. Now, when we talk about the 30 Years' War, we're talking about a conflict that happened within Europe between 1618 and 1648. Now, originally it started as a religious conflict, but eventually it's going to become a geopolitical battle between powerful organizations within the European continent. Now, there's four phases within the 30 Years' War. There's the Bohemian phase, the Danish phase, the Swedish phase, and the Franco-Swedish phase, more so France than anybody else. Now, the outcome of the 30 Years' War is eventually going to become the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, and we'll talk about that, but overall the war is going to have huge social and economic implications. So if we look at the religious situation in Europe about 1560, this is kind of what we see. In the other day, we talked about the Reformation and kind of the political influence that had on Europe at this time. And so you can feel free to pause this and take a look at just the differences that exist within Europe. The difference between a Roman Catholic South and more of a Lutheran or Protestant, if you will, northern portion of Europe. Now, to give you some historical context, we talked about Martin Luther the other day, and John Calvin, and so on and so forth. But really, John Huss is in 1415. He is the quote-unquote first reformer of the church, of the Catholic Church, or what they're doing. And so this happened in a region called Bohemia. And what happened to John Huss is he was burned at the stake for his inability to kind of assimilate or acquiesce to Roman Catholic doctrine. And so Bohemia becomes a hotbed of contention between Protestants and Catholics. Now by 1600, Protestants are going to outnumber Catholics in the region, but they're largely fragmented in different denominations or different religious sects within Protestantism or Christianity. Now, Emperor Rudolf II issues a letter of majesty granting some limited freedoms and tolerance to Protestants. However, he dies before this can fully take effect. And Ferdinand II was to become the new king of Bohemia, and the Protestants really feared the worst. In addition, Catholics forbade Protestants to build churches in towns where Protestant churches did not exist already. So there's definitely some prejudice and some mistreatment towards Protestants during this period of time. Now, to kind of settle these differences, the Protestants set up a meeting with Catholic officials in Prague on May 23rd, 1618. And the meeting went awful. Okay, the Protestants actually seized two Catholic officials and tossed them out of a window. And they also tossed out a secretary as well. Now, these individuals survived the fall because people claim that they landed either on a dung heap or a ditch or a big pile of hay. And the Catholics claim that angels had saved them. Now, this event is known as the Defenestration of Prague, and what this means is just a Latin word for the window and means kind of out the window. Now, this is going to be the spark that ignited the 30 Years' War. So again, if you can take a look at these, this is the event that leads to what will become the 30 Years' War. Literally, Catholics getting tossed out the window, and here's kind of a depiction of the people that are tossed out the window being saved by angels. Now, like we talked about, there are four different phases of the 30 Years' War: the Bohemian, the Danish, the Swedish, and the French. And if you take a second and pause this, you can see that the numbers indicate kind of where these come from. So 1, all right, from the Bohemian phase, 2 from the Danish phase, 3 the Swedish phase, and 4 the French phase. For the most part, those are what we will be discussing. All right, let's get right into it, shall we? So, starting with the Bohemian phase, 1618 to 1625, the fighting began as soon as the three Catholic officials were thrown out the window. Now, the Protestants used a force made up mostly of Czechs and disposed Ferdinand, King of Bohemia. But they chose Frederick V to take his place. The Holy Roman Empire at that time will become Ferdinand II. He used funds from the Catholic League and the Spanish Habsburgs to build an army. Eventually, what we're going to see is the Catholic forces crush the Protestants. Now, one thing to keep in mind when we talk about this, if we take a look, this is a map from earlier on, before the 30 Years' War takes place. But eventually what we're going to see, like we talked about, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, this is outlined in black here, is going to align or get funds and help from the Habsburg Empire. And you can see the Habsburgs are basically going to be anything in orange, yellow, or green. The countries in blue, or the regions in blue, are going to be the enemies of the Habsburgs. So we can see that the Habsburgs really had a stronghold in the Iberian Peninsula and Central Europe as well. And also some footholds here in these regions, but these are more for resources than anything else. Now, as the Bohemian phase keeps going, mercenaries join the fray to kind of look for some extra money in the war. All right, and one of the guys that really make a notable difference in the 30 Years' War was a guy by the name of Wallenstein. Now, he was born a Czech Protestant, and he offered his services to the emperor. Now, reluctantly, the emperor accepts him. Okay, and what happens is Wallenstein unleashes total devastation on Germany. Eventually, to the point where the emperor really doesn't have a whole lot of control over Wallenstein or his men, which is an issue. It's a concern. Now, the enemies of the Habsburg Empire were horrified at Wallenstein's antics. Okay, so much that the second phase comes about, the Danish phase, that King Christian IV of Denmark decides to enter the war to help the Protestants and turn the tide within Germany. Wallenstein was way too much for Christian. And so what we see is the Habsburgs are able to reach the pinnacle of their power by about 1630. However, about 1630, the emperor felt pressure from all across Europe to control Wallenstein. It's kind of like he unleashed a monster across all of Europe. And so the emperor made Wallenstein back off. Now, Protestantism on the continent seemed to be in trouble. So a guy by the name of King Godolphus Adavus from Sweden entered his 100,000 man army into the contest. And if you take a look at the map up here, you can see the red areas. This kind of notes kind of the Catholic opposition to Protestantism. All right, where we see the Kingdom of Sweden, today Sweden and Finland and some of the Baltic states as well, are really kind of the only saving grace for Protestantism. Now, Gustavus Adolphus, he experiences a little bit of success in the north, and the emperor decides that he needs a little bit of help, so he requests the services of Wallenstein once again. What happens? Okay, well, eventually what we see is kind of like a stalemate, if you will, to a point. Gustavus Adolphus is going to suffer a wound and eventually die in battle. Okay, and by 1634, the Swedes look like they're at a point of defeat. However, even though things are looking very bad for Protestants in Germany, there is another country that's going to come into play here, and this country is going to be France. Now, France was an enemy of the Habsburg Empire, and the Habsburgs were kind of aligning themselves with the Catholic influenced Holy Roman Empire. And so France really couldn't stand to watch the Habsburgs increase their power, and so the French decided that they're going to enter the war on the side of the Protestants. Now, neither side really possessed the power to knock the other out, so the fighting dragged on for about another, 13 years or so. And so if you take a look here, and looking at this map, we have the Habsburg Empire and other regions that are kind of aligned with them in pink. You can kind of see this. All right, part of their empire directly or aligned with them. All right, and some of the enemies that exist against this empire. So really we see a huge dichotomy within Europe at this time. Now eventually this war is going to decimate the European population. All right, more so in Germany than anywhere else. So the war is eventually going to end, and this is at an at 1648 was something we call the Peace of Westphalia. Now, what happened at this treaty is that it recognized sovereignty for about 300 German princes. The northern states of Germany primarily remained Protestant, while the southern states of Germany remained, for the most part, Catholic. Sweden won cash and land in the Baltic region, and France won some more territory as well. But the biggest thing is it's going to have not only peace in Europe, but it's also going to give some countries that were kind of fighting for their independence more of their sovereignty or independence, if you will. Portugal, Netherlands, so on and so forth. These countries will become major players down the road. So if we take a look, and feel free to pause this at any time, this is the involvement in different countries or kingdoms in the 30 Years' War. Actually, I suggest that you do take a moment and just pause this and kind of look at this and see kind of where the sideline or where the battle lines were drawn between these different entities. So by 1648, this is what Europe looks like. All right, so we can see that the Spanish Habsburg and their empire is still fairly strong down here in the south. Okay, but then we see that France has gained a little bit of territory. The church has got some territories. All right. But essentially, this is it. And it does bring, like I said, about that period of peace. Now, some of the immediate impacts of the war, because Spain lost territory and France gained territory, France will become the most powerful nation on the continent at this time. And that's going to come into play very soon. Actually, tomorrow we'll talk more about kind of the implications of that with another growing monarchy. So what we see is that the Holy Roman Empire are much more fragmented because you have it essentially divided between 300 different princes and a north and a south. Okay, the Habsburg family kind of loses a little bit of influence, and the Holy Roman Empire, their political sway is significantly diminished. Now, this war decimated European populations. So if you take a look at this map over here, this is going to chronicle population decreases or losses during the 30 Years' War. And so you can see specific areas where you're going to have a very, very high percentage of people that were lost. Over 50% in these areas, 40 to 50, so on and so forth. It's roughly estimated that the German population decreased by about 20%. Battle, disease, starvation, so on and so forth, all those things kind of contributed to this. Now, even though they, for the most part, were able to survive in some degree, food shortages plagued Germany and worsened the suffering of Germans who survived. Inflation crushed the economy, all right? Prices skyrocketed, and trade routes essentially stopped for the most part as well within the region. So after the 30 Years' War, this area, the Holy Roman Empire, today what we call modern Germany, came to essentially a standstill. This is called the Triumph of Death, and if you take a look, this is an artist by the name of Bruegel, and he chronicles kind of what it would have looked like during the 30 Years' War. And just take a second, pause, and really look over just the destruction of what things would have been like, according to this artist's rendition. So the aftermath of the war, this is what Europe is going to look like. You can see you have Portugal that's now independent. All right, Spain, Habsburg Spain. Okay, they still have some areas down here. France has gotten bigger, and this portion of Central Europe is really fragmented. But we're going to draw our attention here on France and England tomorrow as we start to talk about what's going to happen within the 7 Years' War, and essentially the first true global battle over trade routes and for essentially world power status.